John Cameron is our guest tonight. His website is called coldcasecameron.com. His book is called It's Me, Edward Wayne Edwards, the Serial Killer You Never Heard of. John, again, it's an honor to have you here tonight and to get this information out for people to hear about and get a little bit of media coverage and get people thinking a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. That really is the whole intent of this, is to get it out, because there really are a lot of innocent people that not only sitting in prison, but there's a lot of people that have been accused of many of this man's murders throughout the decades, and it just leaves that question hanging over their head, and they have to live with their life of being accused of killing someone they didn't do, and getting this out will do that. So I appreciate you having me on.
Well, it's an honor to have you here, and again, as we mentioned before just a few minutes ago, if anybody in the first segment having you on, if anybody has somebody out there that you can tie to it. Again, the one gentleman down in Florida that might have encountered this individual, or maybe even somewhere. John, is this guy struck in almost all the states, or does he have favorite places to hang out?
Well, on a letter on my website dated July of '93, you can read it there. He lists, I think, around 20 states and cities that he actually had a file put on him together through the FBI. And I found killings in every one of the states that he listed in that letter. So there will be killings in every state, because that really was his goal, was to hit every state and kill in every state. So I imagine I probably have covered maybe half of the states right now in my timeline.
Right. Yeah, in the section, the wrongfully accused, I was looking at at the news break, and again, all the people that have been arrested and executed, and obviously died in prison and didn't need to because of this individual.
Well, yeah, that's the execution of innocent people is something that really tied this whole case together. Because in 1956, when Edwards came to Great Falls, Montana here and killed that couple on a lover's lane, that was on New Year's of 1956, just before he showed up in my hometown, he had been in San Francisco, and he kidnapped a little 14-year-old girl named Stephanie Bryan, and he planted her body at this man named Burton Abbott's cabin, and he basically led the editor of the San Francisco Examiner under assumed name to the body, and they arrested this Burton Abbott, and they tried him, and he was convicted in January of 1956, the same month that Edwards came here and executed the two people on a lover's lane. And then Edwards was arrested shortly after that and went to Deer Lodge Prison. And while Edwards was sitting in Deer Lodge Prison, Burton Abbott was executed in California for that murder. And so when he came out of Deer Lodge Prison in 1959, he decided that he was going to be the executioner. And that's why he donned the executioner's hood in the Zodiac case in 1969, and he told his victims that he had been in Deer Lodge Prison. Edwards was the judge, jury, and executioner, killing people, steering the evidence to the innocent, watching the innocent get convicted, and then watching them get executed. And so even as he's dead right now, he's having people killed by what he's done.
Yeah. One of the questions that came in from an email, Tracy sent an email and says, John, did Edwards ever work for the mafia as a hitman?
No, he actually killed mafia members and tried to set mafia members up. He would target groups such as the mafia to kill and steer the evidence to plant it against them so the police would go after the mafia. So he had a lot of ties to the mafia, and if you look at that letter I just referred to on my website, July of '93, he lists all the mafia members he knew and was friends with, and it's amazing. He not only was friends with the mafia, but he was also friends with Charlie Manson. He was in prison with Charlie Manson in 1952, and he knew him his whole life, and actually targeted San Francisco during Charlie Manson's reign. terror there, because Charlie Manson was committing helter-skelter and getting a lot of publicity, and Edwards went there and committed the Zodiac and stole it away.
Did he look up to Manson?
No, he hated Manson. He didn't look up to anybody. Edwards was the top dog in his mind, and he says that in the Google confessions that are on my website. It's amazing. His ego was incredible. So although he would know all these people, they would not be his friends. They would be somebody he would love to set up and target.
Yeah, looking through this, it's interesting. Now, in the accused, like this gentleman named of Michael Skakel from Cambridge, Connecticut, he was released in 2013. Were you instrumental in getting him released?
No, that murder came into the investigation after Michael was released. I didn't really pay much attention to that murder. I didn't really recall it. But then it came into the press back in 2012, and they released him because he's innocent. And that was a Halloween killing of a little girl laid out ritualistically, and the target there was a Kennedy to set up, and it worked. It took a long time, but eventually it worked. And then Skakel was released because there was no evidence. And it was a lot of false testimony. That's what he was convicted on. So he's supposed to be retried, but I see that it doesn't appear they're going to retry him now.
The one in Illinois, a couple of these, it's interesting when you go through these cases. A lot of them, the congressman Gary Condit, in Chandra Levy, and I remember one of the last ones here, the Christopher Coleman, about killing his wife and sons. Again, is there ties there to Coleman with Edwards? I mean, is there a link there that you found, or if you could talk expound a little bit on that?
Yeah, I'll talk about the Christopher Coleman case. That came in after the book was written and published, and just recently, that just came in the last 6 months. But that was Edwards' last murder, May 5th, 2009. He actually got arrested 2 months later for his first murder. But that was also done on the anniversary of the killing of the West Memphis Three, May 5th, in 1993, and Edwards did that murder. But Christopher Coleman was a married man working for Joyce Meyer's Ministries. He was the head of security. He had two little beautiful blonde-haired boys and a beautiful wife. And somebody entered their house while they were asleep, strangled the two little boys while they were asleep, strangled the wife, wrote helter-skelter messages typed all over the walls, and set up Christopher Coleman for the murder. And he went down for it and got convicted and is sitting in prison right now for the murder of his wife and two children in their beds while they slept, which was really just another one of Edwards' Joan Benet Ramsey type murders, killing kids inside their house and steering the evidence toward the parent, and it worked. And that Christopher Coleman had so many ritualistic ties to Ed Edwards. I contacted the Colemans right away back earlier this year. I haven't talked to them in 3 or 4 months, and I don't know what's going on with Christopher Coleman now other than he's sitting in prison, and he is innocent and was set up by Ed Edwards just before he was caught.
One thing I find interesting, John, is like with these killings, like with the Coleman thing, Edwards was quite up there in age to do these things. I mean, he had to be pretty masterful. I mean, he wasn't a young guy in '09 by any means.
No, that actually helped him get into his ruse. It's very easy to open the door for a 70-year-old man with a cane in his hand who's there for who knows what reason, whatever the ruse is. Edwards always got into his victims. It wasn't like he's running around kidnapping kids off the street or things like that. He's being allowed in to his victims' houses, and that's how he's able to do it. And that's what happened in the Coleman case. He had gotten inside that family prior to killing them, and he did that in every one of the cases. That you had mentioned Chandra Levy a little bit ago, and that was a good case to bring up because that case was designed to set up a congressman, Gary Condit, and it almost worked. But Chandra Levy also let her killer in. Everybody always wondered how did she end up in that park. in Washington, D.C., with her remains spread there, but she had never left her apartment. She was actually let her killer in, and Edwards killed her there in the bathtub and then held her body for a year and planted it in the park a year later. Actually planted Chandra's head in the park on the day that her parents were on Oprah Winfrey begging for the release of their daughter. And it was staged to do it that way, and it worked.
It's amazing that this guy could. It's amazing he could accomplish all this stuff. But like you said, when you're able to connect with somebody, and I would assume that a lot of these people that he killed, he befriended them. It's like having a friend over for dinner and maybe knowing someone for quite some time, and then all of a sudden, and I don't say that jokingly, but I mean surprise, they just get you when you least expect it.
Yeah, Edwards' ruse was he was always under assumed name, so regardless of who the victim was, they never knew him as Ed Edwards. They never knew who this person that came into their life was Ed Edwards. But his ruse was he was a doctor of psychiatry, he was a preacher, and he was a police officer. Those were the three most trusting people, and he had credentials that would prove he was all three of these people. He actually had offices, doctor psychiatry offices, and had patients coming into his offices, paying him, and all he was really doing was gaining access to more victims. So he used the psychiatry ruse and hypnosis. He was a hypnosis specialist. He could hypnotize people. He was very good. And he had done this since the 50s. And this is all documented through FBI reports from the 50s when he was caught, that he was using the ruse of a psychiatrist. And he used that ruse all the way up until his capture. And when you go back and look at all of his victims in the last 10 years of his life in the 2000s, almost every one of them was seeing a doctor of psychiatry for something or a counselor. And he had gotten himself in. That's how he did it, and they would always die very close-natured, punched in the throat. That's what he called it, the rabbit punch. And the signature thing in the autopsy for the rabbit punch is the broken hyoid bone, which is in the throat. And that means that the killer got real close, and he was unsuspecting. When he whacks them in the throat, they go down. They can't do anything but their conscience to live the horror he's about to do them. That's what he liked to do.
Were a lot of his victims, John, when he was doing these, it sounds like he had a whole menu of things he would do to these people. Would a lot of these people, would they still be alive when he was, I don't want to say experimenting on them, but doing different things to them?
Not really. He killed them immediately. He may have had some conversations with them shortly, but he tried to get the upper hand and kill them immediately, and then stage the bodies with false wounds, false blood patterns, lay them out ritualistically, tie them up ritualistically. So he would do all this post-mortem stuff to make the crime look like something it wasn't. And so most of the victims I found in a lot of his cases didn't go through a lot of torture. They were killed immediately, and then the crime was staged.
You mentioned that you had an opportunity to speak with his wife. What does his family think of him? I mean, did she have any clue?
Well, in 2009, when he gets arrested, he was living in Kentucky with his wife. All of his kids were grown and had their own families living elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And, the kids, when I interviewed the kids, they always said, don't even talk to Mom because she can't remember anything. And that is very true. She really went through a life of hypnosis. She was an abuse survivor for 43 years, living with the worst man in the world, but taking care of the kids. He had the good side. He had the family side. He went to church with his family and his kids, and he taught his kids wrestling and all of this. Then he had his evil side, which a lot of the family didn't know about, but he was never home, and they did see some horrible things. He did stab his wife, refused to let her go to the hospital, and actually cared for her himself. He was that good. once he was identified as a killer, they just wanted him to confess to all of the killings because they knew there were more, but he didn't, and he's just devastated that family. And Kay Edwards is devastated, and I just feel sorry for her because she's just like the Stockholm syndrome when you're kidnapped and you just start to like your captor, and he was her captor for 43 years.
Was she aware of the things he was doing, or like you said, she was under hypnosis a lot? Did he obviously he was playing a lot of mind games with her? Obviously, had her in a state of confusion all the time.
All the time. That's a good way to put it. When I've spoke to her twice in person, and there are moments of light where you'll see her wake up and start talking, but no, she lived for 43 years with the most abusive man there ever has been, and I was able to find out how he treated his wives when I found his wife that he had here in 1956, and he took that wife all over the country killing, and she drove the getaway car while he changed into the uniform or portrayed himself as a doctor. So once I found her, I really got an insight as to what this man was capable of, and she said the moment she met him that he raped her and was in complete control, and that she would have done anything he said, and she would have never went to the police because she was more afraid of him than anything. And that woman was married to him in 1956, and I talked to her in 2012. She's still alive, and nobody had ever talked to her.
Wow, and just horrific. A couple questions that came in for you, John. It says, John, do you have any feelings as to Edwards being driven by maybe some sort of a paranormal evil or other outside entities driving his lust to kill? Maybe voices?
Well,
kind of like,
my personal opinion is yes. That's exactly I really believe he felt he had superior powers, and clearly he did for as long as he got away with it. Now, whether or not those are powers that are granted through God or whatever, I think that he played into something that is so ancient history, and did it so well that it almost seems as if he was possessed to me.
Yeah.
That he was Chucky. He was the horrible child. He was possessed.
Well, and it almost seems like, you could throw another little twist on it and say that while he was possessed and doing these things, maybe something out there was watching out for him and allowing him to go ahead and do that. I mean, he had to be a mastermind to execute that many individuals and get away with it. I mean, that's a mastermind to be able to do something like that.
Yeah, if you look at it in the terms of the way he looked at it, Jesus did a lot of good for the world in the last 2,000 years. But Edwards was Satan, and so he did lots of evil, but he did his evil thinking that in the far distant future, his evil was going to be looked at as if it did some good. I know that sounds horrible, but that's exactly the way he looked at it. That everything he did over his life, eventually in history, is going to prove that he was exposing bad.
Yeah.
Even though he was killing everybody. And that's really the essence of what he felt it was going to do. That he blogged it, and I have that in my book on one of the chapters where he says that someday, maybe 500 years down the road, somebody will look back at Zodiac and think that he did some good for the world.
Wow. Bob from the East Coast writes in and just throw this out there. It says, Pat, it says, there's an unsolved murder of a teenage girl in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's on the news every year. I think it was around the holidays 21 years ago. Her name was Beth Ellen Vinson in 1994 in Raleigh, North Carolina. Any chance Mr. Edwards could be connected to that or was in that area?
He was definitely out in 1994. He killed one of his last ones in my book is in North Carolina on Fort Bragg. Yeah, he spent a lot of time in North Carolina. The one thing about Edwards, his book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, once I put that into a PDF file, I was able to search all the cities he had been in that he wrote about in the book. North Carolina is throughout the book. So there would definitely be more murders there. I know I found a few since the book was released. But if your readers want to read his book, they can go on my website, coldcasecameron.com, and I have a free download of a text version of that book. And you can read it yourself and look for your cities or your states in there, and you'll see that he's been everywhere.
Yeah, it's amazing. And again, as John says to the listeners out there, if you kind of like Bob on the East Coast, shoot him off an email. He can put it in his list of notes, and maybe just take a look. I mean, maybe there's some connectivity there. Obviously, there are other people out there that are doing heinous things, but again, maybe the ones that they can't find. It is interesting that when you have someone like this who is so well traveled, maybe he is involved in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, many times what I found on Edwards' victims is that the crime scenes are just staged. There's always strange things, such as women, if they're murdered, they may have items clutched in their hands. It might be a class ring, it might be a watch, it might be hair, it might be bobby pins. He did things like that and deliberately left evidence placed funny at scenes so police would be confused. So any of the listeners that have murders out there that they feel that he may have done and they have some information on the homicide, just look for those types of signs. Was there strange things going on at the scene that didn't make sense? All of them didn't make sense. They were either completely terrorizing murders, or they were murders that were directed to somebody that everybody would say, well, he would have never killed his wife, and yet all the evidence suggested he killed his wife.
Right.
That's how Edwards worked.
Did he? Rich writes in, said, John, did Edwards ever kill any law enforcement or FBI people with someone he might have gotten close to? Any police officers killed?
Yes, down in Florida, especially after John Walsh's kid, Adam Walsh, was kidnapped and killed in 1981, and I tied Edwards to that case. I was able to recover a letter that Edwards wrote to the police in 1981 where he actually makes a confession to killing police officers in Florida. And I went and researched some unsolved police officer cases in Florida, and there's quite a few down there. One in particular occurred in 2004, and I believe Edwards did that one. So yeah, there'll be police officers probably all over the place that have been killed by this man, because if he got pulled over and knew that the gig was up, he would have killed them. And they would have never known who he was because he was always under assumed identity, so he would have gotten away with it.
Very interesting, very interesting. What about, if we could maybe talk about some of the other serial killers? In writing your book and in your work, John, have you delved into some of the other ones?
I delved into serial killers, John Douglas, all the books that he wrote back in the 90s, and I really got into that stuff. With this investigation of Edwards, I got the best lesson I've ever had on serial killers, because what Edwards would do is whenever there was a serial killer that was making headlines, he would go in and steal the headlines by creating a murder that would take it out of the picture. And he did that his whole life. And so on my timeline, I'm starting to put in when other serial killers were caught into the timeline, so the people reading my timeline can see exactly how he operated. Because you'll see, like, when Otis Toole, the man accused of killing Adam Walsh in 1981, died September of 96. Edwards killed Joan Benet Ramsey 3 months later. He always followed serial killers, the Green River Killer, all of them. BTK, the Unabomber who was caught here in Montana, just west of Great Falls here, he followed him and would always outdo them with another murder. the Unabomber was also caught in 96, and that was the year that he killed Joe Monet Ramsey also. He would steal the headlines from any other serial killer by creating a murder that would take over in the press.
Do you think he, somebody sent in a question, kind of a long, lot of text, but do you think that he, and I think what he's asking is, do you think he collaborated with any other serial killers?
Yeah. One particularly is a guy named Frank Dryman, and I don't mind naming him. He's still alive, but he's in prison, in Deer Lodge Prison. Frank Dryman killed a police officer here, or killed a store clerk here in Montana back in 52, and ended up in Deer Lodge Prison. And Edwards and him ended up in Deer Lodge Prison together, and kind of became partners in Deer Lodge Prison in crime, killing people in prison and actually partaking in the Deer Lodge Prison riot in 1959. But both Dryman and Edwards were out of prison in 1968, and were running around the Vallejo, California area where the Zodiac happened. And that's when Edwards was trying to set Dryman up for those murders. And Dryman ran from parole in 1970 and never got caught until 2010, and was living down in Arizona pretending to be a preacher at a wedding chapel. But I believe that Dryman and Edwards conspired on many murders, but didn't partake in them directly together, but knew what their plan was. They both were Satanists. They were both operating under the same type of killing regiment, I guess you'd say. But now Frank Dryman, I got a chapter in my book on him. He's in Deer Lodge Prison now. He's about 80-some years old. But when I interviewed him, he really gave me a lesson on satanic spirituality.
Do some of these guys, John, when you and I don't know, well, in your research and when you as a police officer and meeting with these criminals, especially the ones that are on death row, do any of them want to fess up, or do any of them sit back and say, hey, I know I'm never going to walk out of these doors. Let me tell you what's going to happen, or do they all tend to kind of like Edwards, do they tend to play games right to the end?
It seems most serial killers, when caught, they finally do sit down and confess, and then they give interviews to the news and all of that. But Edwards was never going to do that, because he had basically done that his whole life, only he had done it in a manner of he was always giving it out, but nobody was understanding what he was putting out, whether it be in his books, in his letters, in his movies, in his radio interviews. He was always putting out what he had done. But in the end, when he confessed in 96, just after killing Joe Monet, to 50 years of murder and the 500 victims, he said there was no need for him to have to stand up and say, I did all this, because it's already out there, and he knew it would live on much longer if it were left a mystery, and that his name would live on much longer that way. You can read that confession January 8th, 97 on my timeline. He makes it pretty clear.
The one I know that he doesn't consider himself a serial killer, but Richard Kuklinski. I've been
the mobster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had a couple of different guests on the program that have written books about him, actually who have met him. Several books have been written about him, and I know he was a little bit of a bragger, but I truly believe that he killed well over 100 people. And while he, his whole alibi was, hey, I was hired by the mob, I was getting paid good money. But if you ever get an opportunity to watch his interviews, it wasn't about money by any means. He definitely enjoyed doing what he did, and kind of the same ruse as this guy. A great he didn't have a lot of friends, but a great family man. Provided for his family, and until he was arrested out in front of his home, his family never had a clue.
Yeah, I actually got to do a program on True TV about that guy back in 2007, and I got to review his interviews and a lot of the evidence in the court cases and do a show regarding him. He was a fascinating study of a really mean, nasty guy who portrayed himself as a family man.
Right.
And that actually helped in this case because at that time I thought that guy was the most horrible guy I've ever heard of. But Edwards out-tops that Kalitsky guy by so far. He probably knew him, would be my guess. He knew most of the mobsters.
Yeah, Kuklinski, like I said, he enjoyed doing what he was doing in no feeling at all, no remorse at all. Talk about it, and I know he went through a bad childhood too, did horrific things to animals at a young age, but a guy that just had no feelings, guy that just, to come up to you or me or anybody on the street and blow their head off or slit their wrists or light them on fire or whatever, it just didn't faze him. I mean, just unbelievable, and kind of like with Edwards here, it just takes I don't want to say a certain kind of individual. That's probably not the right term to use, but you obviously have to have just no remorse, no regard, no respect for human life. But it sounds like this guy obviously was maybe kind of like the 44 special killer in New York. Hearing noises in his head to continue on like this.
Yeah, there's 5 interviews on YouTube of Edward Edwards in 2010 that your listeners can watch, and just watch them if you really want to get into the mind of a serial killer with no remorse, because he'll tell you right there and stare into the camera, and it's really amazing what he says in those interviews, and the look in his eye. He flat says that he just has no conscience, and it never bothered him. And if people want to get in the mind of a serial killer, watch those 5 interviews of Ed Edwards in 2010. That was him actually going to the press, trying to get somebody to listen to him, and because they weren't. And so that's exactly what the Zodiac Killer always did, is go to the press and demand to be listened to. And Edwards did it in the end. And our YouTube videos can be found by just searching Edward Wayne Edwards, and you'll see them all.
They'll pop up. What you mentioned that you're working on another book, John. Are you again? Is there just so much here to cover? It's going to take another book, you feel, to delve more into the details.
I've had a lot of people that read the book that have asked just dozens of questions that want answered, and that's what the second book would be. Is since I released the book, the amount of information I found that Edwards had put out on the internet regarding his blogging was incredible, and it's in a book in itself. So I think the thing to do is I'm going to release a book that's basically in his own words as to why he did it and how he did it, because he put it all out there. And now that I've found all that, I think that would be the second book. Plus, there's so many other victims that I want to put in the book so that people will look into those cases.
Are there people that have you had the opportunity to interview a lot of interview families of victims, and are you going to continue to do that and maybe delve more into things and at least maybe give some people some closure?
Yeah, it kind of looks like this is going to be the rest of my life. It's been really awesome meeting a lot of the victims' families. Edwards left some of his victims alive over the decades. He would terrorize them and then actually let them go so they could describe him. So I've met some of those victims also. And it's horrible what he did, but most of the victims that survived or had a loved one taken by this man knew something wasn't right just before the murder happened, and have gotten a lot of closure talking with me about what this guy did.
So then there were people that that was a question I had for you too. Was there anybody that got away? Yeah,
a young girl in California in 1974 at the age of 13, and it was the most incredible story I ever heard. He drove her around for 2 hours and detailed his entire life of killing to her, and then let her go. But she was a runaway girl and didn't report it. And then 20 years down the road, did report it. And when she heard about my investigation a few years ago, she contacted me to tell the story, and it was unbelievable. He basically kidnapped her to tell her exactly who he was and leave her to describe him as a game, to catch me if he can. and that's terrorized her whole life.
Did any of these people, John, did any of them go to the police when he would, now like when the case with this girl or the victims that he encountered that survived, they obviously not, I mean, was he looking for somebody to tell the police but never gave them enough information to actually pin him down?
Yeah, he was always looking to keep himself in the media. So when he terrorized this little girl, this was 3 years after the Zodiac case happened, and the Zodiac case had kind of fell out of the press. But that case kind of came back then in the mid-'70s, because that's exactly what Edwards would do, is kidnap people, keep them alive, tell them specific things. They'd go to the police and report it, and there'd be more stories that the Zodiac killer may possibly still be alive. And that's really always been the myth. The Zodiac killer, is he still alive since 1968? And he was killing the entire time, every year, every decade. And so all the stories about, they make fun of the Zodiac now, but it's nothing to make fun of. The guy really was alive his whole life, killing and setting up people.
Very, very interesting. John, why don't you give out your website again, and where people can get your book and contact you?
Sure, my website is www.coldcasecameron.com, and that website was put up with the intent of helping solve other murders that are out there. And the book, It's Me, Edward Wayne Edwards, the Serial Killer You Never Heard Of. It's by Golden Door Press. You can get that on my website at coldcasecameron.com, and if you buy it there, I'll sign it and send it to you. Or you can go on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's available everywhere else. It's not available in Kindle yet. But I was hoping to have that in the future.
Gotcha. John, I want to thank you so much for being on tonight. And again, anybody that, as one listener said, he thinks that possibly, I mean, maybe it's a long shot, maybe encountered this gentleman years ago, and some of these. If there's somebody in your town or somebody that went missing or was murdered or whatever, and I mean, just send you, all you can do, it just takes a second to go to your website and send you off an email, and maybe it could help somebody. Maybe there's a little something there to tie things to. I'm sure you've got a book of notes, John, that's thicker than a phone book, and maybe you can do a little bit of digging, and you never know, maybe you can connect some more of the dots.
Yeah, I don't mind taking those emails and just checking it against my timeline. It's really easy, so feel free, anybody listening, to get a hold of me on my website.
Okay, well, I want to thank you so much for being here tonight. It's a holiday weekend. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. And I'd like to circle back around with you down the road when the next book comes out and talk a little bit more about it. I find the subject fascinating, because it is a fascinating subject. I think while people don't like to think about it, and it's horrific things that happen to individuals, it is a subject of interest. And again, it was an honor to have you here, and would love to have you back on again.
Well, thank you very much, Pat, for having me.
Okay, take care, my friend. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.